Evening, everyone. Uh, Thank you once again for joining us in this fifth round. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. But good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you once again for joining us in this fifth round of the People's Migration Challenge. This is an event that is co-organized by a number of organizations at the regional and global level. I'll just uh, here it say first thank you to all the co-organizers who have been putting these programs, this series together, to begin with Alianza Americas, the Action Committee, the uh, Climate Migration and Development Platform, the CCRM, which is the Cross-Regional Center for Migrants and Refugees, the GRFDT, Migrant Forum in Asia, PICUM, and Builders and Woodworkers International, the Global Union Federation, and South Asia Regional Trade Union Council. Thank you to the organizers for the tireless efforts made in putting these rounds together and making this happen, which has largely started off as a socialization of the Global Compact on Migration and now become more and more to focus on key areas, thematic areas that are very pertinent to migration governance discourse today. And one of the big issues that we are discussing today is race, ethnicity, and migration. And while for some, because of what we've seen in media in recent months, particularly in the last year, and you have saw a couple of years before that, this issue might be seeming new or surfacing again on the global stage kind of thing, the whole question of race. And but when you look at it, there is a big connection between race and migration that goes back historically to 100 years ago. Even when you look at some countries, for example, when you look at Australia's white policy kind of thing, and you realize that states have made policies with regard to race, ethnicity, and nationality, and things like that. This kind of discriminatory practices and policy. When we are discovering in our discussions, we have said also that one of the big kind of framework issues under which we are looking at these five thematic areas is regular pathways and regularization. And then one must ask ourselves this question today: in the pathways that have been opened up for migration, is there a nuance of race in them? Or in the pathways that have been restricted for migrants and mobility, is there a nuance of race in there? When we talk about regularization programs, is there a nuancing of race and ethnicity in that? When we talk about labor migration programs and wages, therefore very clearly we in our region have challenged the whole notion of how wages in many parts of our region here in Asia are determined based on nationality, not on years of experience or skill, but simply on nationality. So there is a big connection between race and migration, and it's not new. It has historical moorings, and these need to be challenged in the current framework that we have in the Global Compact. We need to challenge that and see how we move to a more just framework of the migration governance discourse in which race and ethnicity have no place, definitely not in its discriminatory overtones. And for that, we thank our today's moderator, Stella Opoku, who is very well informed on these issues and has been struggling with these issues as an organization, and very aware of these issues, not only today, but historically as well. She has been very strong in spearheading the whole notion of migration and development. And she will guide us through this discussion today on race and how it intersects with the migration discourse. I thank everybody for joining us. And I hope in this session today, we will be able to look at some of the from a critical perspective, what needs to change, what needs to give for a more just and equitable migration governance framework. Stella, I hand over the platform to you. Thank you for doing this for us today.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, William. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us in from. Thank you all very much for joining us for this very important discussion today. I think William has already raised a number of key questions really in relation to this topic on race and ethnicity in migration. And for today's discussions, we will have two very important people who will be joining us on the panel, and we will be hearing from them and their perspectives on some of the work that has been done so far. And I'll be introducing them shortly. But before I do that, I thought it was also quite important just to recap some of the discussions that have been had from the webinar series that have been taking place even from last year, but in particular on this topic of race and ethnicity in migration. So, and I think a lot of you already have seen some of the materials on this, the one-pager, the postcards and recommendations, but these are also very much the key points that our speakers are also going to be focusing on. So I'll just try and do a short sort of recap just to get everyone on board with what some of the key sort of issues are. So last year, the People's Migration Challenge organized two broad discussions among the civil society globally as part of its webinar series. And these were focused on building on internal dialogues about the links between race and migration. I think, as William had said, officially, issues of race and ethnicity have not been considered in migration. And all of us are pretty much on a steep learning curve on how we discuss this much more formally, much more officially, how we address these issues of race and ethnicity in migration. And for all of us, it really is an opportunity also to explore how we incorporate racial justice in the context of migration. Undoubtedly, as we know as well, I mean, migration all over is significantly constrained by issues of race, by ethnicity, by nationality, by class and caste, and so on. And this creates restrictions for different groups of migrants, especially migrants of African descent and migrants from poorer socioeconomic classes. Migrants of African descent in particular are much more discriminated and criminalized compared to others, and are the most likely to be deported on criminal grounds. And these were some of the findings from some of the discussions over the course of the last year or so in terms of the series. In addition, in many ways as well, I think it was also noted that Black Lives Matter has played a catalytic role in naming racism, naming Blackness, and so have other anti-racist movements in calling out structural racism as well. We've also seen alliances strengthen, or anti-racism alliances strengthen across different communities, which is very important in how we overcome issues of race and ethnicity in migration. And then I guess the final point that I wanted to make in relation to that one pager as well was that we really cannot talk about racism and structural racism without talking about the historical legacies of slavery and colonialism, which is really about four centuries and more that have played a significant role in the challenges that we see today globally. The discussions and the webinars also identified or made a number of recommendations. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but there were two in particular that I would like to bring to the attention of our panelists who I'm going to introduce shortly. There was one on building alliances and solidarity among anti-racism movements, linking the fight against anti-Blackness with anti-Latinos, with anti-Latino Asian racism, and organizing collective actions. So that very much speaks to this point about how we develop alliances across different communities to address these issues of race and racism. And then the second one I wanted to share was one that basically says, only by working with partners on the ground to document the racial and ethnic dimension of migration policies, can we raise and name these issues and find solidarity opportunities with other grassroots organizations. So on that, so those were the two recommendations that I wanted to raise. There were a few more, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss some of these today. So on that, I would now like to go to our speakers for their reflections on these points that were raised in the one-pager and the postcards as well. So for today, we have two panelists. We have Commissioner Mrs. Margaret May Macaulay, and we have Deputy Mayor Mr. Philip Thompson. And I'll do a quick introduction of both of them, and then we will set the ball rolling. So just to introduce Margaret May Macaulay, she's the Commissioner of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. She was re-elected by the General Assembly of the OAS in 2019 for a further 4-year term. And previously, she had also been elected for 4 years previous to that. She is currently an attorney in private practice. She serves as mediator in the Supreme Court of Jamaica and as associate arbitrator, as well as serving as a notary public. And she took part in the reform and drafting of laws in Jamaica and is well known as a strong proponent of and authority on women's rights. And she's also a citizen of Jamaica. Mr. Philip Thompson is the Deputy Mayor of New York. He's the co-chair of the Task Force for Racial Inclusion and Equity. He's also Commissioner of Racial Justice Commission. As Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives, he's responsible for spearheading a diverse collection of priority initiatives. And these include, I wouldn't be able to go through all of them, but it is very impressive, but these include Democracy NYC, the Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises Program, the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, the Young Men's Initiative. His agency portfolio also includes the Departments of Youth and Community Development. And he has a vast and impressive portfolio, as I said. We are very delighted to have you both here with us, and we feel very privileged that you've been able to join us. I would like to start with Margaret May Macaulay, if I may, and just really to get your reflections on some of the key points that were raised through the webinar series that we've had, and also some of the recommendations as well that were made. Would like to hear your reflections on this. So I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Stella, the commissioner is not yet joined, so we're trying to contact her. If you could give us a few minutes.
No problem. No problem. Thank you. In that case, I will go to Mr. Philip Thompson to set the ball rolling. And it's a similar question as well, really, which is about your reflections on some of the key points that came through the webinar series and some of the points that we've just shared with you. And then also perhaps a better understanding of how national government authorities can also be allies in working towards achieving some of these action points as well. So you have the floor, Mr. Thompson.
Well, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to join you today. And I was delighted to read the one-pager and the postcards to learn about the dialogue that you've been having, because I think it's right on point, and you are addressing the essential issues. I'm also really happy that you are picking up and focusing on the race issue, and also dealing with multi-ethnic, multiracial, multinational solidarity on the ground. In the United States, there have been a lot of efforts recently to divide Afro-descendant, Asian, and Latino people. There have been thousands of attacks of Black and Latinos recently against Asian migrants as well as Asian citizens. There are rising tensions between Latinos and Asians as well. And these kinds of attacks are actually being fostered and initiated by very conservative, very right-wing white nationalist groups and individuals, including our former president, Donald Trump. So this is an important topic for us right now. I would second what Stella Opaku-Owusu said, that race and migration is not a new topic. My family was forced to leave Africa hundreds of years ago, and then were enslaved in the United States as during the early days of capitalism. And that's true of many millions of Afro-descendant people all throughout the Americas. And that is the most dramatic migration in world history to this day. And that happened hundreds of years ago. So the very fact we have to bring race into the conversation about migration, and it's a new thing for many of us, ought to make us scratch our heads and wonder, how can that be? When the largest migration in history happened hundreds of years ago, was actually foundational for the emergence of Western capitalism and imperialism and colonialism, and we are just now focusing on it. What does that say about how we're educated? And who controls discourse in the world in which we live? I will just make a couple of points and then, open it up. I'm sure, the discussion will be the most important thing. One, race is an essential part of capitalism historically, of the emergence of Western prominence historically, for two reasons. One is direct exploitation of people and resources in non-European countries. Slavery, colonialism, today's mineral extractions, resource extractions, the kinds of things that happen in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to extract, cobalt and other kinds of minerals would never be tolerated in Western Europe. It would never be tolerated, in North America. But those kinds of things happen in countries of color. Direct exploitation has always been a part of it. The second part of it, which isn't discussed as much, and is absolutely as foundational to how Western countries operate, is the misdirection of workers in rich countries in the West to see their enemies as to see migrants, to see people of color as the ones who are responsible for their own declining standards of living or their own problems in their own lives, is to misdirect their anger towards people coming across borders, towards migrants who are themselves victims of the very same things, of the very same systems. But that misdirection is absolutely foundational to how politics works in the United States. It is why we are seeing the rise of right-wing nationalism throughout Europe and all around the world. That misdirection has always been part of how the system works politically in rich countries. And the final thing I will say is part of what wealthy countries do in the West is to support corrupt, repressive, backward-thinking leaders in poor countries, or in the case of the United States, in communities of color, to create more division, more confusion, more misdirection in our own communities. And so those are the challenges we face, you know, as migrants, as people of color. Overall, we not only have to fight the white nationalists and fascists who are rising in the West, we also have to deal with real corruption and misdirection, anti-democratic forces in our own communities and our own countries who receive all kinds of support from outside of our communities. So anyway, that's all I have to say to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for that. You've raised some key points there, and I'm glad also that you started off. You know, I think one of the key points that you raised there, of course, was about the tensions that are sort of rising within the different communities, and of course the fact that there just seems to be this agenda to try to divide different races and different communities to be against each other, as opposed to having that sort of solidarity. But also, I think that very key point when we talk about the historical legacy, which is very much the fact that we are now starting to, as you said, formally, if you like, officially introduce this question of race into migration, when actually the largest, as you said, migration that ever took place, the underpinning, you know, the force was race. And I think that is absolutely a strong point that you made there. The additional points that you made, and I think you spelled this out really well in terms of the areas of direct exploitation of resources and people in the West. And then also, I think this really did resonate with me, being based in the UK, when you spoke about the misdirection of workers in the West to see people of color and see each other as the problem. And that, for me, kind of spells out how we ended up with Brexit, but I won't talk too much about that at this point. But I think there's definitely a point in there. But I suppose the question, just to try to build on this a little bit more, the question really is, and I think you've painted for us the global challenge, if you like, and also the fact that really when we talk about racism or race in migration, ethnicity in migration, we're talking about structural issues. How do we start to break this down in terms of how we overcome this, or how we address the key sort of issues, and how do we break this down within the context of migration in terms of discussions that we have, and also across different sectors, right? So we are, of course, on the civil society side, and then of course you have local authorities and national, you know, the government, international institutions, etc. How do we begin to discuss this in a much more concrete way that begins to break this down really into, we know what the practice looks like, we know what it looks like when we see it, but how do we begin to get beyond this? I think a lot of us are in a way almost tired of talking about this, you know, and thinking that there needs to be a lot more action. How do we do this? And I suppose it would also be good to hear from you in terms of initiatives that you have on your end that perhaps are addressing some of these issues, and how you're looking to also develop alliances across local authorities, with civil society, and with others as well.
Thank you. So in New York City, we established something called the Task Force on Racial Equity and Inclusion about a year and a half ago, during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of us actually were very involved in cultivating the Black Lives Matter movement over many years. It didn't emerge overnight. It started about, 8 or 9 years ago with organizing in a bunch of states against police repression mainly, but also bringing young activists and organizers together, working on strategies, building solidarity and ties amongst each other. There was a gathering of 650 Black, Latino, and older white veterans of the 1960s civil rights movement who came together in Mississippi about 6, 8, 9 years ago actually, and started working together. And the origins of Black Lives Matter as a movement actually was there. And so when the movement really caught hold a year and a half or so ago, we as a government, we're in the midst of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, in which in Black and Latino communities, the death rates were 2 or 3 times higher than in other communities. And, there was a consensus, we have to do something. And so we started coming up with all kinds of immediate initiatives, things we could do right away, dozens of them, to address racism in New York City. And things the city, our mayor, Bill de Blasio, me, and others, we asked all the agencies to come up with recommendations and things we could do right now. So we did a lot of things in terms of direct healthcare provision, in terms of PPE equipment for, in communities of color, in terms of broadband access in poor communities, and in terms of immediate food. We fed 1 million people a day. We with 600 soup lines, we call them. We did a lot of things, but we felt that wasn't enough. And we established a charter revision commission. The city has a charter, which is like the city's constitution that governs all city agencies. And we set up a charter revision commission focused on racial justice. And so the commission has been operating, it has 9 commissioners. It's been operating about 9 months, and its charge is to look at the city charter, find out what needs to change and how we can initiate a process for uprooting structural racism in our agencies, in our policies, in our city. And that work is going to take a long time. And what we are doing are coming up with ballot measures that will go before the voters to make permanent changes in our charter to address structural racism. And really it begins with, you have to start at the beginning. How did we end up in a city in which white people own property and people of color don't? Why, how did that happen in the first place? And we have to go back to the beginning. People of color didn't have an opportunity to own property. In fact, we were property. That's how it happened. And government actually created these disparities that we're dealing with, created global poverty, created, racial exclusion. Government did that. And so government has an obligation to undo that. And so how do we do that? So those are the kinds of conversations we're having. We have 50 agencies in New York. So we have a lot of work to do, because in every single sector, there's some slightly different story in terms of mechanisms and structures, but the consistent theme is who had power and how did they use that power? And now we're gaining power. And so for us, the challenge is, how do we educate and prepare ourselves so that we can make these kinds of changes? How do we educate our communities so that they are constantly vigilant and stay on top of these issues, and so forth? That's what we're in. And I'll just say, in the United States, in every major city, people of color are a majority. And if you take young white people in cities, they voted, 80% of them voted for Obama twice. And so there's a rising force of people of color and progressive young white folks. And that is why we have Donald Trump. That is why we have efforts to roll back voting rights in our country. That is why we have rising racist violence, because there's never been a force like that in the United States history that ultimately will be a majority. And that is really unsettling all of our politics in our country. And it puts us in a position that if we are united, if we do have a clear agenda, we have the potential to actually change who United States is, what United States policies are. And we're making a symbol of that in New York, because we do have that power in New York right now. And so learning how to exercise it, learning how to keep vigilant, make sure our elected officials and others are not sort of divided and bought off, co-opted, all of that stuff is on the table. We have to stay focused on our mission. And that's why the things you brought up today are directly relevant to what we're dealing with. Every effort is being made to divide us and send us off in different directions, rather than focusing on structural racism, rather than focusing on inequality, rather than focusing on solidarity amongst people.
Mr. Thompson, thank you so much for those very, very strong words. I think some of the, for me, just by listening to you, in terms of some of the initiatives, of course, that, as you said, a lot of you have already been involved and were involved, with the start of BLM and Black Lives Matter, as you mentioned, 8 or 9 years ago. But also, I think some of those very key points and questions around who controls the discourse, who has the power, and how do we change that? And I think that point that you made about this new emerging sort of force, if you like, so the progressive young white people together with together with young and old, of course, Black people as well in the US. And it seems to me that, as you're saying, it seems to me that that is quite evident. And of course, in terms of how you change the narrative as well, and how you control the discourse, and how you tell the story, it's also about this sort of growing, emerging young force, if you like, in terms of their perceptions, which are probably much more, shall I say, much more sort of like modern, but much more progressive as well. And it will be good perhaps to get more of a reflection of that a little bit later on. But thank you very much for those points, and we will come back to some of that and some of the specific examples as well that you mentioned. I believe we have Commissioner Margaret May Macaulay with us. So I'm going to turn to her now. I did do an introduction earlier on, so I wouldn't go into that again. However, we've had a number of discussions already, and Mr. Thompson has covered a fair bit of ground for us. We've sort of gone global, and then we've brought it right down to very specific examples. But I wondered, Ms. Macaulay, if you could perhaps share your own reflections on some of the work that has already been carried out through the webinar series, which of course resulted in that one-page discussion paper, as well as a number of recommendations as well. And perhaps what I can do, just to bring you on board with us, is just to raise a couple of points actually, or a couple of recommendations that we sort of covered as well in the discussions, but these were some of the recommendations and postcards that came out of the webinar. And these were relating to building alliances and solidarity across different communities to fight against anti-Blackness, anti-Asian racism, and organizing collective actions, and also, of course, anti-Latino racism, etc. So that was one of the recommendations. And then the other one was around also working with partners on the ground to document the racial and ethnic dimension of migration policies. And only by doing this can we raise and name these issues and find solidarity opportunities with other grassroots organizations. And then I suppose with your specific background as well, it would be good perhaps in your reflections also for us to hear a little bit more about racism, where it's not just about artificial borders, but it's also about within the borders themselves, right? So in terms of migration, and there's this example about, for example, the indigenous people in Guatemala, Mother Earth is for everyone, and it's the artificial borders that force people to divide and migrate. And it would be good perhaps to hear some of your reflections on that as well. But I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Stella. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I do apologize for signing in late. I somehow mixed up the time. I thought we were starting at 8:30. So, these things happen in COVID times, it seems. I actually had prepared the first commentary in relation to the first question to deal with the ethno-racial perspective in the context of recent migration flows in the Americas. But the Commission has been very concerned as to the size and challenges of this serious problem, which is not going to get better, but it's going to increase in numbers. And we don't seem to be able to deal with it effectively. So I have to start. I'm going to start first to perform the two strong messages from the postcards and the paper discussion. And accessing justice for migrant workers in relation to their labor rights should not be tied to their migration status. Okay, so non-documented migrant workers, refugees, stateless persons, trafficked persons, even smuggled persons, all persons, regardless of their immigration status, need to be guaranteed their effective judicial remedies as part of their rights of access to justice. And migrant workers around the world face numerous barriers for accessing justice because, among other reasons, of inadequate information about their rights and the procedures in the destination countries, and challenges of evidentiary and documentary requirements for claims that they may make, which are made worse by inappropriate hurdles of obtaining replacement documents, centralization of recruitment agencies, insurers and government agencies, resulting in practical, financial, and psychological obstacles to their access. The necessity of legal assistance for most redress mechanisms and its limited availability, corruption or perceptions of corruption associated with the mechanisms and documentation. In this vein, I want to highlight that there are certain groups of migrant workers who, due to patterns of historical inequality, are more exposed to situations of discrimination, intolerance, and hate crimes because of their ethnic racial background, their gender identity and or expression, sexual orientation, and disability, among other factors. An example is the case of Haitian migration flow in Chile. This was a study which showed that 86% of Haitians in Chile find it more difficult to find work than other migrants. This research also reveals that among the Haitian population, those who find employment do so mainly in the category of unskilled work, that is 30.7%, a group of which 32.1% acknowledged not having a written contract, and 34.3% said they only had a temporary contract. In its monitoring labor work, the Inter-American Commission has observed as an obstacle of migrants' access to justice the practice of racial profiling, particularly of African descendants and indigenous persons, including people of color, brown people, and other means of self-recognition. We see that in some countries in the Americas, Black migrants are overrepresented in prisons and generally do not have any legal assistance. In this regard, I give us an example, the case of Afro-Colombian workers in Ecuador. The Commission has found that undocumented Black Colombian workers in Ecuador experience more border detentions than migrants of other ethnic racial backgrounds. I would like to suggest several recommendations on this point. In the first place, we need law reforms, emphasizing transparency across the labor migration system and private sector accountability, and of all recruitment agencies, brokers, insurers, and others, and ensuring that effective pathways exist for migrant workers to access justice. This includes clarifying the legal rights and responsibilities of all actors and establishing clearly defined enforcement and redress procedures for breaches of existing statutory and contractual obligations. Second, to promote the adoption of affordable insurance programs for migrant workers. Third, to standardize procedures and make them transparent. Fourth, to make the claims process simpler and more transparent, and require the insurer to meet the payout ratio, which reflects appropriate coverage of the most common risks to migrant workers at all stages of the migration process. Fifth, to regulate recruitment agencies more effectively, including through more rigorous government oversight and transparent licensing procedures, which require ongoing compliance with worker protection and reparatory responsibilities. Second, the second statement addressed in the postcard is use of the term essential workers. As rapporteur on the rights of people of African descent, I must say the following. Last year, the Commission referred to how people of African descent and Latin persons were represented in essential jobs in the United States, and that made this population more exposed to the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that Latin persons and Afro-descendants from recent migration flows from Ethiopia, Congo, Cameroon, and other African countries, and Haiti, face obstacles to regulating their immigration status in the United States, which means that the possibilities of access to jobs in satisfactory conditions are lower. On the other hand, they are all overrepresented in essential jobs. Talking about essential workers is a way of making visible the situation of structural discrimination. We need to set the spotlight on this and the task forces for the immediate protection of this population. Those are my, my statements on the first question. To do I end there and until later? Or do I continue?
That's brilliant. I would like to ask you a follow-up question, and then perhaps that might lead into some of the other points that you have there. But thank you so much for this. I think I like the fact that you've already started to take us, or to help us to take the recommendations that were raised through the webinars. You started to look at those and to help us to take it forward, which is really helpful. And also, of course, you've given us some real food for thought as well, with some very specific examples. You mentioned the Haitian migration flow, for example, in Chile, and of course the instances, or the fact that there's been the practice of racial profiling, which of course impacts on how people are treated. And then also Afro-Colombian migrants as well in Ecuador, who seem to be the most discriminated against as well. I guess in relation to to some of the recommendations that you were making, and I think in particular that last point that you made, and I think it would be helpful perhaps to try and expand on that a little bit more, which was around the use of the term essential workers. And perhaps how that in itself could be challenging or problematic in terms of the visibility, perhaps, of the specific, discrimination, I suppose, that people or that workers actually face. And I just wondered if you could expand on that just a little bit more for us.
Okay, I will try to do that. In what we have found in our monitoring of the situation in our region that the Commission mandate applies to, is that there are present in every country several layers of historical structural discrimination, and which straddles the Afro-descendants who are in place and have been for centuries, and the indigenous peoples who are, of course, were the first peoples in these states. And then we have the influx of what we would call new migrants, persons of color, of African descent, of Asian origin, and so on and so forth. And in relation to every single group, the Commission's monitoring has found that because of the existing structural discriminatory practices, policies, actions, laws, and so on, these people are discriminated against across the board. But more so are the Afro-descendants, the Black people, and the indigenous people. The degree of the discrimination against them is much greater. And so that when they do, as migrants, arrive at various states, some of them may be highly qualified professionals, but because of the structural existing discrimination and clear racism, they can only find employment in what is described as essential workers, essential work. And the treatment, the remuneration, the lack of access to health services, lack of access to justice, lack of access to any kind of protection legally for them is enormous. And without the intervention of civil society and what the Commission does in its mandate when matters are brought to its attention and and we find out certain conditions and actions going on and make our public statements and ask questions of the state and ask them to rectify positions. These people are well nigh invisible and their conditions are invisible. And one has to conclude and not merely suspect that this is purposeful. Because in many instances, the conditions exist in such a poor state of treatment because of the cohesion of the state and major business interests of private or mixed private and state-owned businesses. So they are really in a difficult, if one can say impossible situation. In fact, I remember a hearing which we had some years ago, and I was on the panel and asked the representative of, I think it was Peru, because the civil society had brought out the point that the indigenous people and tribal peoples in certain areas where there were extractive industry and large agricultural industries, that the police were being employed by the business entities to take action, physical and really violent action using firearms as well against the people, indigenous persons in the area, to even use passage, their passage, which they've used for centuries, through lands which had been assigned by government contract to big business. And I remember asking the Peruvian representative, government representative, is this not government complicity in using your police, I concluded illegally, to cause harm, take the lives violently of your own people? And how do you explain this? And the answer, which I recall, was that this was a contract that the business entity entered into with the police officers. I said, but they work for the state as police. Surely you have the power to do something about it. And we made a recommendation that this ought to stop, that sort of practice. And these people were, of course, only employed by the business entities as essential workers, never in the offices, the administration, or the policy-making section of these businesses. And this is true across the region. And we are still battling with it. So I hope I expanded a bit.
Yes, absolutely. You have definitely expanded and given us, even more information, I think also from a regional perspective as well, because I think the more we've had these discussions, even within the global civil society groups, etc., the more we also recognize that it's important for all of us to begin to appreciate the differences when it comes to issues of race and ethnicity and migration. Each region will have a slightly different sort of visibility in terms of what it actually looks like, and that it's important for us to really understand that. So I'm glad that you also brought up, in terms of talking about essential workers, you also brought up this point about which is related specifically to indigenous and tribal people as well. which I think is particularly key. And I think, I mean, in terms of essential workers as well, I think for some of us, it's definitely given us a different way also of how we view this, because there is also the other element which a lot of us had been seeing and of course talking about in relation to our work within the migration context, which was around the fact that, you know, essential workers and migrants who are essential workers were in some ways being acknowledged, but there's also this other side of it as well, which I think you've addressed very eloquently as well, in terms of what the challenge could also be for that as well. So thank you really for that. At this point, just looking at the time, I think what I'd like to do, I do have a couple more questions for yourself and for Mr. Thompson as well, which is much more around, I suppose, in terms of the next steps, which we've sort of started to address, but much more around how national government authorities can be allies in working towards this. So I suppose in terms of working across the different sectors, from civil society to national government to other international organizations, how can we work together? And also, if there are any other existing partnerships in your country or region, if you can share some of this with us. I know both of you have shared some really good examples with us, but I'd like you to hold on to that for a moment, because I would like to just open it up to the participants as well. So just to say, if anybody wants to come in to ask a question, I've been looking at the chat. I haven't identified one yet, but if you have a question that you would like to ask, please do feel free to put your hand up and I will ask you to come in and ask your question. In the meantime, I'm going to find out if I'm going to call a couple of people to the floor to either make an intervention or to ask a question, and I'll see if they are here. So I have Akil. I don't know if Akil is with us. If you are, please unmute yourself. So you can make your intervention or ask your question. And in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for Akil hopefully to join us, I've also got Alex O.
Alex is here. That's me.
Alex, yes, brilliant. Alex, you have the floor.
All right, this is a surprise. I wasn't expecting this. Is it my birthday today?
It may very well be.
Well, good day to everybody. I know some of you are kind of like early morning and others are a little later, close to midnight, I suppose, in some places. It's great that everybody's here. I see there's a huge turnout, well over nearly 200, if I'm not wrong, or more than 200. It's fantastic. I would like to share some thoughts here after I've heard Deputy Mayor Philip Thompson and the Commissioner Margaret McCauley. And I'm going to say something that I normally do, which is to basically annoy everybody in the room. I'm going to say this. I'm going to give you an example of something I really heard from a friend of mine who's a kind of a social worker in a country, and she works with basically asylum seekers. So we're talking migration here. We're talking about foreigner in a country. And in this country, which I won't name, the system is that the asylum seeker is given some help, language classes and so forth. But after a while, the asylum seeker is supposed to graduate out of that help program, find work, and basically integrate into society. My friend tells me that she's having a huge problem. There's a particular migrant community where the women don't ever graduate to work. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. There is patriarchy, there is religion. And so there's this conflict between what is expected of the asylum seeker and what the migrant holds dear as their community values. Well, it so happens that it also maps over skin color. All right. So now you have this problem. Is this racism? And how do you correct this? Do you expect the host country then to change policy to accommodate a totally different cultural viewpoint and continue to support the non-worker for the rest of her life? What do we do? So I think what I'm trying to say here is that it's very easy to see racism when in fact there are so many other factors at play when people cross borders, because they bring with them a very different culture, a very different expectation, and a very different, maybe religious set of values. And I think what Commissioner Macaulay said, I don't know if others noticed it, which I thought was very important, is that maybe the way forward is just to fix the nitty-gritty, like access to justice, access to healthcare. And then after you've done that, you see what happens after that. All right, is there still a difference in outcome by race and ethnicity? Because if so, then you start to address it. But not to go straight marching in and see race and ethnicity first, but to see these other practical things like poor governance, corruption, police forces being bought and so forth, and deal with those things first, and then see what's left after that. And if they're still mapping over color and ethnicity, then maybe some affirmative action may need to be taken. But at all times, let's be very clear that it is not a case of angels and devils. There are going to be real differences of opinion. And we should be very careful not to see racism where it might not exist. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. I understand now why I was asked to call on you. Thanks very much for that caution. But I think you raise a very important point on intersectionality, which we haven't really, had much of a discussion about. But I think, you know, a lot of discussions have been about, of course, addressing race on its own, because that's absolutely important, race and ethnicity on its own, but also being aware and understanding that, you know, within the context of migration, there is race and ethnicity at play, but there is also that intersectionality that also comes into force. And sometimes if you're crossing all those, if you're ticking all those boxes, then you're probably going to have one of the hardest times. So an undocumented migrant woman who's also Black, etc. And then you begin to tick all of that. And I think we have ourselves questions around how do we feel that it's important that we give each one of those, and in this case, we're talking about race and ethnicity, we give it the attention that it deserves. But the question then is also, how do you then also grapple with those questions and issues around intersectionality as well? And actually on that, I'm going to come back to both of you. Before I go back to the floor, I'm going to come back to Mr. Thompson, first of all, perhaps to hear a little bit of your thoughts on that, and then I'll go to Commissioner Macaulay as well.
Thank you. I have 2 points. One, race is a practical issue. It's an immediate issue. It's not an afterthought. And if you look at the Venezuelan migrants who've poured into Colombia, and if you look at who are the worst off amongst them, it happens to be Afro-Venezuelans. If you look in Colombia and who's going across the border into Ecuador, who's being murdered now for trying to stand up for their rights in Chocó, it's Afro-Colombians. In fact, you can go anywhere in Latin America or anywhere in the Americas, and guaranteed the group that will be on the bottom economically, socially, the victims of violence will be Afro descendants and indigenous peoples, no matter where you go. And that includes in the United States, We have people being murdered in the streets in the United States, Black. That's not happening to white folks. It's happening, it is an immediate issue for us. And it is not an afterthought. And it is not something that comes after justice. In fact, it's the heart of justice. Our prisons are 9% of Black young people are in prison in the United States or in the criminal justice system. That's not true of any other group. It's a devastating situation for us. So I would disagree with the previous speaker that other issues come first. By the way, my mother was a Black woman. I've worked with Black women all my life. And regardless of what the men say, Black women that I've encountered everywhere don't like being repressed, don't like being an afterthought. They want rights too. That's what I have found. And they may not be the clerics, they may not be the ones who are sitting in the halls of power, but personally, I don't believe we as Black people, we as oppressed people will ever get anywhere when our women are repressed, when they don't have a voice, when they don't have a seat at the table. I think that is a key issue as part of our oppression, as part of why we are where we are. The other thing I would say is, to use an analogy, if you look in the United States, the third world is becoming dominant in the first world. That's one way of thinking about it. If you look in New York State, New York City, in California, people of color are now governing. The head of the legislature in California is people of color. In New York State, it's Black-led, both houses of the legislature. We have an incoming Black mayor, and so on. New York City spends $50 billion a year buying goods and services. New York State spends $70 billion a year buying goods and services. Our retirement funds that are public in New York City and state are almost $1 trillion. In California, it's double that. And so the challenge before us right now is we've never had that power and control before. We could actually use our resources to change economic development in the Caribbean, in Central America. We can punish companies that don't treat workers well. We can punish companies that discriminate against Black people, Indigenous people, women. We can punish countries that are actually driving migration right now and making it impossible for people to survive in Haiti and many other places. But we've never built institutions to do that because we've never had this power before. And the most immediate challenge for us is overcoming our plantation slave mentality and overcoming our colonialist mentality that has not equipped us to actually develop these capacities to use this power. And so that's what we're working on. That's what I'm working on. Before the pandemic, I started inviting businesses from Cali, Colombia, from Ghana, from Accra, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, to say, come tell us what you produce because we in New York City buy everything. And there's no reason we can't buy from you. But we're not gonna buy from you if you don't treat your workers well. We're not gonna buy from you if you support repression in your own country, of your own people. We're gonna set standards. And so we're just beginning this. But to me, that's how we begin to address the issues of, economic drivers of migration, of essential workers not being treated well, and so forth. And we are just learning how to do that.
Thompson, thank you so much. I mean, that's absolutely powerful. And also, I think you've definitely hit the nail on the head on the fact that we have the resources, and increasingly in the West, we can see the resources. I mean, we work with diaspora communities because we understand and believe these resources. And also it's, I think the points that you made about the fact that it's important for us to overcome our slavery and colonial mentality, and then to raise, it's not even about the same standards, I think it's also about raising the standards, as you said, and maintaining those standards as well, and constantly reviewing them. And actually, in a moment, there's a participant in Ngozi who made some key points which I think are quite related to this, about just about her perception of a number of things on the African continent. But before we go to her, let me just go to Commissioner Macaulay for her response to that last comment that was made by Alex, or perhaps on intersectionality.
I think Philip has adequately and completely given a full answer to that. But from the what I call what our region, the Inter-American system, I cannot speak for Jamaica, not whilst I'm commissioner, because I'm not allowed to do that. So I could talk about other Caribbean countries, but not Jamaica. And in relation to the Americas, that we deal with the Inter-American Commission's mandated area. I agree with what Philip says. The fact is, if you do look at the numbers, the facts, the reality about what is happening on the ground and has happened in the past, the recent past, the very far past, and presently, it is quite clear that racism against Afro-descendant persons and against indigenous persons in the Americas is a reality. It is not something which is concluded too early when certain things happen. I happened to hear a news item last night about 4 young men who were convicted of rape of a young white woman. And when they were in their teens, teenagers, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. And they had just been exonerated and found, evidence was found that they were completely innocent of the charge. False evidence was produced against them. These were 4 Black young men. 2 of them died whilst they were still in prison, and the other 2, I think, have died after they were exonerated. This would not have happened to 4 young white boys, but it happens all the time to young Black men. And the number and quantity of rape of women is much larger for the Afro woman and the indigenous woman. That is what we have found in our region. So it is not that, and then when you look at the employment figures as well, the number of Black women, young Black men, indigenous persons, young women, and so on, who are employed in unskilled labor. They are not, and let's face it, they're not encouraged to reach their potential education-wise. Their schools are not well equipped in their regions, and yet, as Philip has mentioned, they are surmounting, lots more are surmounting difficulties, and which makes it evident that were they not discriminated against and their regions where they live not taken as forgotten areas of non-development, they would do so much better. And that is the fear which exists in the people who are more comfortable within structural discriminatory governments, practices. And as Philip said, that we have the Trump era, the Trumpism, the Trumpers coming out of the woodwork because of their fear of the advancement of those who they've always wanted to keep down. I think we have to find the tools and we have to educate all of us, the persons of the Blacks, persons of color, Indigenous, Asian, Latinos, Hispanics, all of us, and the whites, that we are all simply this, human beings entitled to live lives of dignity and of rights. We mustn't only educate ourselves, we must educate all around us. And this is the policy of the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Macaulay. I'm just having a quick look at my time. Okay, I think we have a few minutes, but thank you so much for that input. And I think also for bringing out this point as well about education and of course the focus on young people as well. In terms of course, in terms of the, the perception, I suppose, but also just educating, as you said, educating young people, but the impacts, I suppose, of what racism does for people of color, where you have young people who do not have certain privileges, if you like, and therefore find themselves in this context, in terms of that example that you've just used there. But there is I think there's a whole discussion around how we can work more, I suppose, with young people and how we can do more in terms of education that could address some of these issues, that we are talking about. I would like to bring on Ngozi, who had made a point relating to some key challenges that she had identified on the African continent. And I thought it would be quite good because we've been talking about what racism looks like in different regions as well. And I thought it would be quite good for her to share this. Ngozi, are you able to unmute yourself? This is Ngozi Uzoma.
Yes, I am Ngozi. I'm a he. Yeah.
Anyway, yes, Ngozi.
Yeah. Ngozi is normally a feminine name in this part of the world, but circumstances of my birth gave me Ngozi. So that's it. Talking about ethnicity, racism, and migration. Yeah, in Africa, you can't expect a country, a continent, or a people that are divided into 54 entities with 54 armed forces, several rebel groups. Just in Nigeria, we have a rebel group here. It's called IPOB. We have others in the northeast of Nigeria, you call Boko Haram, and we have several agitators, separatist groups. You go to Cameroon, you have the Ambazonian forces that are fighting to have their independence there. Everywhere is proliferated with arms and ammunition, heavy weapons, heavy and light machine guns, you see? So you don't expect the continent to have peace if you keep dumping arms and ammunition here. You know, some people, you think this thing, they don't have impact. They have ripple effects on the socioeconomic aspect of life in Africa. And this thing is pushing people into regular migration, creating refugee situations, but we don't see it from that prison. If we see it from that prison, they will stop dumping arms and ammunition here. The other time, the cannons of arms that we are fired in Northeast, we are seen to be having insignia of NATO. Yeah. So this is the racism has the migration has connection with ethnicity and racism and colonialism. The dumping of arms and ammunition, it creates refugee situations here. We don't use the arms here to have love parade and party. It creates refugee situation and push people into irregular migration. Thank you.
Ngozi, thank you very much. I think the points about, I think, just understanding that, you know, even as we talk about race and ethnicity in migration, but also understanding that actually, as we've said before, those historical, like the legacies relating to slavery and colonialism, and the impact that it's had even in terms of the relationships between the African continent, the West, or the richer countries, etc. And therefore, you have some of the impacts, of course, that you've mentioned as well, in relation to arms and weapons and all of that. And I think that all of these are quite connected and things that we do need to bear in mind when we're having these sort of broad discussions as well. But thanks very much for that. And in a moment when Mr. Thompson and the Commissioner are sort of wrapping up, they may be able to touch on that as well. I'm just very quickly, I had called on Akil before, so I'm just going to ask him if he can unmute himself and make his intervention very quickly. I think I've probably got a couple of minutes now. So Akil, if you can come on, and then I'll go back to our panelists. Thank you.
Hi, Stella. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself earlier. So I have 2 quick points. Hope I'm audible to all of you. Okay, there was some mention about colonization and its relationship to race, ethnicities, and migration. And from a regional perspective, or largely from a South Asian perspective, we could see that both colonial and even post-colonial states also could not change their approach towards race and ethnicities, especially we can say caste. From Indian context, we can say the approach to caste have never changed, and that actually affected their lower caste people's aspiration to migrate cross border. So we could see that there are hardly any lower caste people migrate because due to the lack of collateral and because of their failure to be part of any migratory network that is mostly dominated by middle caste and like upper middle class people. So we could see that even if they manage to migrate, it's just a reproduction of their vulnerabilities. And second thing is that the origin countries are we could see from the global south, we can see that the origin countries are yet to address the race and ethnicity question, and that is definitely having an impact on the aspirations of such community to migrate. And these are the 2 points, and I would like to say that the question of intersectionalities also exists very much in countries like India, where class, caste, gender, and everything just creates or reproduce the vulnerabilities faced by migrants in the origin countries, and they just reproduce the vulnerabilities at the destination countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Akil. Thanks very much for raising those points relating to the caste, the system, and also intersectionality in India, as you've mentioned. I am going to go also very quickly now I understand we have just a little bit more time. So I'm going to go very quickly to Eva Richter, who also wanted to come in and make a comment. And then after her, I'm going to go back to our panelists for their responses and for them to wrap up as well.
Thank you, Stella, for giving me the floor. I would like to come in on the side of Commissioner Macaulay's latest comments upon education. I feel very strongly that obviously we do have to concern ourselves with the structural inequalities that are built into our institutions. And there certainly has been racism for the longest time that anyone can imagine. However, I think that in eradicating racism, we are dealing with hearts and minds. We are dealing with individual reactions. We are dealing with the ability of people to change their views and to become more reasonable. And this really requires educational dialogue. Now, educational dialogue is a very, very messy process. It takes a very long time. It is not something that can simply be mandated with a stroke of a pen. It takes a real dialogue and a willingness to come to understanding. It is a person by person kind of thing, and therefore it is slow. It is slow and it has not always been very effective immediately. However, I'm very much afraid that a very sudden change in cultural institutions plays into the tendency that we already had towards pendulum swings. We're either this or that. We're doing either this or that, not both and at the same time. And we have to develop a greater flexibility of mind that will accommodate many responses at the same time, many ideas, and examine them for their reliability and their ability to change us. It is very, very natural, obviously, and it is very necessary to look at the structural institutions and look at the structural changes that are necessary, and many of them are. But simply change for the sake of change is also very destabilizing and very dangerous. I'm worried about the destabilization of these very revolutionary views and very militant views. And I am pleading for the same kind of thing that Commissioner Macaulay was pleading for, education across the board. Thank you very much.
Eva, thank you very much for your comments and for, of course, the points that you've made around, I suppose, where we strike the balance as well. But I think that very important point around education, as you said, being a journey in itself, educational dialogue, and dealing with hearts and minds, or as some of us might say, winning hearts and minds as well. But thanks very much for that. So I am now going to go back to our panelists. And really, I'm not going to be able to open up to anyone else, I'm afraid, but I'm going to go back to Mr. Thompson and to Commissioner Macaulay for them to pick up on any of the points that have been raised that they want to perhaps address very quickly. And then also, I think the earlier question really, which was around the next steps and much more around alliances between civil society and national government authorities and other institutions as well, in terms of working together with, of course, a focus on race and ethnicity and migration, and how we take this forward. So I'm going to go to, I think I'm going to swap it around this time. I'm going to go to Commissioner Macaulay first, and then I'll come to Mr. Thompson second.
Thank you so very much, Stella, because I am getting rather worked up about the time because I have to leave for the Supreme Court on time. But let me deal with the third issue of alliances between governments and civil society organizations. And international bodies. I think this is vital. One thing that I certainly have found as a commissioner is that without the work of civil society, the commission's work will not advance as effectively as it does. And certainly we in all our public hearings and our working meetings with government officials and civil society, we encourage close collaborative work between governments and civil society. And we insist that in matters of the particular rights which civil society, a particular civil society or group of them are working on, governments must work with them transparently with full disclosure of information. Of course, I'm not going to the extreme of high security matters and so on and so forth. But that is a debate on its own. But I mean in economic, social, cultural, environmental, justice, health, education, and all the rights of every kind. And participation in decision making at all times. When civil society is working with government on a particular issue, they must meet, they must discuss together, they must work on the framework of all policies together. And in this way, government will be properly informed about what is happening on the ground, because civil society are the ones who know this. Government tend to be in their ivory towers and just try to paternalistically work out plans. This is no longer acceptable, and it's not workable. So they must together, and as I say, with us as an international human rights regional body, also we work closely with them in similar fashion, and that we try to implement and design permanent and sustainable measures to deal with the particular issues which they bring to attention and to government. And in that way, then one can find the workable solutions to really meet with and deal with the issues which ought to be dealt with by government in order to ensure the access which everyone needs to the exercise of their rights. And so ultimately, as we say, we must have, or we would then have an ideal world with workable societies within our respective states. I know we only have a few minutes, so I think I'll end it there. I'm sure Patrick is going to add his great sense to the point.
Okay. Thank you so much, Commissioner Macaulay. Thanks for those words. And I will go straight to Mr. Thompson. I'm just aware of our time now, so coming straight to you.
Oh, well, thank you. And I enjoyed participating with all of you this morning. And thank you, Commissioner, for sharing the podium. First, I want to say that our former president in the United States, Donald Trump, called Nigeria and Haiti shithole countries. And people from those countries, he said, shouldn't come here. He called Mexican migrants rapists. He said Muslim immigrants are terrorists. He said Black Americans can't be trusted to vote in elections in the US because Black Americans are cheaters. And so to the point of education, yeah, we have to do a lot of education in this country, and we don't have a lot of time. So we have to figure out how to do popular education. That's high priority for us because it's a real issue for us. Secondly, the head of the US Congress Committee on Foreign Relations is a Black African-American Congressman, Greg Meeks from New York City. We, as African-Americans, are now becoming approached. We're being approached by countries like China that are saying, you know, the military industry wants to have a Cold War with China. And the weapons industries would make a lot of money from a Cold War with China. You know, is there any way we can build a movement for peace? And
Bullshit.
As African Americans, we have no interest in war with anyone really. But in our conversations with China, we're saying, well, what are you doing to actually make African Americans want to work with you? What are you doing? And we're asking them, what are your policies in Africa and the Caribbean as part of that conversation? And I say this to say, we've never been in this position before. As I was mentioned earlier, of where nations want to approach us to talk about these big global issues. But that's where we are now. And it's very important, I think, for all of us to think about how we begin to have conversations from civil society, from our various countries, so that we are all working together to exercise a maximum amount of leverage and pressure where we can. And, you know, I would very much appreciate or look forward to further dialogue along those lines.
That's great. Thank you so much to Mr. Thompson and Commissioner Macaulay for your final words there. I've taken, I think, 3 or 4 key things from that all together. I think the points made around developing institutions, absolutely critical. It's about how we utilize our resources. Education, I think you're both talking about education. Mr. Thompson is talking about popular education and stuff that we need to do right now, especially when we have leaders who are saying, you know, who are supposed to be leading and are also, of course, you know, sort of reiterating all these connotations of racism. So absolutely informal and formal education, and also popular education, as you said. And then I think Commissioner Macaulay also mentioned around civil society participation, full participation. You know, in terms of where you have collaborations or civil society and government collaborations absolutely needed. I think there's a whole lot more. Those are the 3 or 4 key points that I pulled out of that. But just to say thank you very much for this discussion. I think others will really appreciate it. And at this point, I am going to pass my role, in a sense, on to Colin, I think, who's going to be doing the closing. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for participating and staying on. It's still a few minutes after, and we still have 200+ people. Thank you all very much. Mr. Thompson and Commissioner Macaulay, thank you.
And thank you, Stella. Wow, Stella, I know you were playing your, as usual, excellent moderator role and doing it exceptionally well with all the challenges that usually comes with these Zoom webinars that we're stuck in these days. So thank you, a huge thanks to Stella. I know when you're doing that, you didn't get a chance to talk about yourself and your work and your organization's work. For those of us who haven't heard the story yet, Stella and I began this conversation, almost 2 years ago now, talking about where does race fit in migration? How do we elevate this dialogue? How do we bring this forward? And that conversation has led to this series, you know, bringing this on, bringing the range of speakers on, and the 2 wonderful speakers we've had today, and quite provocative discussions we've had so far. It feels that we're not sure where we're going. We're peeling back layers of an onion, I feel, and today was a big layer that we peeled off, right, Stella? And it's really remarkable how far it's come when we look back. And Stella, and we want to thank you again and the work that you do as well, afford. And just want to mention, you know, I've been inspired and really amazed at some of the work that you're doing to reverse racism and institutional racism, the work that you do in taking African artifacts back from the UK and Europe, from museums there back to Africa. That's quite remarkable and quite significant, very, very powerful stuff. So we thank you for playing that role today. To Commissioner Margaret May Macaulay, really, really appreciate you. Thank you. You know, we've stayed on so long. Thank you again for joining us. We respect the work that you're doing at the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the significant work you're trying to address those of Afro-American descent within the Americas. And Deputy Mayor Phil Thompson, you know, Phil, you've really rocked the boat, and really appreciate the work that you've done in one of the most diverse cities in the world, and the work that you've done to bring that beyond New York as well. Thank you so much for that. You know, we often talk about speaking truth to power when we raise these kinds of issues. But Phil, you talk right at the start, you mentioned that we are gaining power too. And that's scarce those in power. That to me was inspiring. Sometimes we're stuck, we're not sure where we're going, what are we doing with this, but we feel it's important, we still kind of do that. But saying that realization That's a paradigm shift. And I appreciate that. And I hope all of us appreciate that we're changing things, and it might be one brick at a time, and we're not seeing all the way to the end on where we're getting to, but we've got to keep doing it. And we've seen the discussions, that the challenges we have, even the discussions in the chat box today about challenging intergovernmental institutions, Western-dominated governments, and our own civil society movements. We cannot ignore that. If we're talking about developing better migration policies, we need to be talking about race central to that. And so I really appreciate both Deputy Mayor Bill Thompson and Commissioner Margaret May Macaulay for joining us in that conversation today. This is our second conversation in this 5th round of the People's Migration Challenge. Our next one will be again next Tuesday. It will be November the 30th, same time, and it will be on detention and return. So do join us then. We are again reaching out to different intergovernmental speakers from different levels and from different regions. And we hope to be able to really kind of take on something that is very, very difficult, very, very challenging in many areas, both for civil society as well as for governments and everyone else, other stakeholders as well, to tackle. But it's essential that we tackle that, and we hope to cover new ground in that conversation as well. Thank you to our 200 plus participants for always joining us in this conversations at all times of the day in all the time zones that you're at. We'll see you again next Tuesday, same time, November 30th. Bye all.
Thank you.